On May 10, 1775, a self-educated Connecticut farmer named Ethan Allen walked through the gates of Fort Ticonderoga, Britain's most strategically important fortress in North America, the one the French called the key to the continent, the one military engineers had spent decades designing to be impregnable, and demanded its surrender. The British garrison commander came to the door in his nightclothes. He surrendered. The entire operation lasted roughly 10 minutes. No artillery, no siege, no months of careful preparation by trained military professionals. 83 frontier farmers with no official authorization, who had crossed a lake in stolen boats in the dark, had just taken the fortress that controlled the only water route between Canada and the American colonies. The fixed point in Britain's North American strategic architecture, gone before breakfast, without a shot fired in either direction. What they found inside made it stranger still. 78 cannons and mortars, left largely intact, sitting in a fort that nobody had thought to evacuate because nobody had believed this was possible. Those cannons would eventually be dragged 300 miles overland through winter mountains and frozen rivers by a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox, hauled on sleds across ice that should not have held the weight. Washington placed them on the Dorchester Heights above Boston in March of 1776. The British looked up, understood what they were looking at, and evacuated the city without a single engagement. The first major American strategic victory of the war, Boston, runs directly back through those cannons, to those boats, to this lake, to this man, and this 10-minute operation that nobody had authorized. Here's the part that makes the whole thing almost impossible to believe.
When the Continental Congress heard what Allen had done, they briefly debated giving the fort back to Britain to avoid escalating the conflict. That is not a misprint. They considered returning it. Then they quietly kept the cannons and said nothing more about it. If you want to understand how 83 men with stolen boats and no orders changed the course of a revolution, stay with me, because the story behind that 10 minutes is stranger and more human than anything the official version admits. That was May 10th, 1775. Here is how it began. 23 days before Ethan Allen crossed Lake Champlain in a stolen boat, the first shots of the American Revolution had been fired on a village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. 23 days. That is how young this war was when it acquired its most consequential fortress.
The Continental Congress was still meeting in Philadelphia, still debating whether a formal army was actually necessary, still drafting letters and petitions to a king who had already decided the conversation was over. George Washington had not yet been appointed to command anything. There was no American military establishment, no chain of command, no treasury, no system for authorizing military operations, and certainly no system for stopping men who had decided to conduct one without permission. Into that vacuum, Ethan Allen moved. But first you need to understand what Ticonderoga actually was, because the name alone does not explain it. Fort Ticonderoga sat at the southern end of Lake Champlain, at the precise point where the lake narrows toward the Lachute River and then opens again toward Lake George.
Control that narrow point, and you control the only practical water highway between Canada and the American colonies, the corridor through which British armies had moved south and could move south again from Montreal. The French had understood this so completely that they had spent years and extraordinary amounts of money fortifying the position, calling it the key to the continent in their dispatches home. The British had taken it from the French in 1759 and held it since, which in 1775 meant they held it the way people hold things they have owned so long they have stopped thinking about them. The garrison, in May of 1775, numbered roughly 48 soldiers. Not 4,800, 48. The fort had seen no serious military threat in years, and the assumption, unexamined, comfortable, and about to be catastrophically wrong, was that it would see none soon. The cannons inside had not moved in years. The walls were crumbling in places.
The commander was a career officer posted to a quiet station at the edge of the empire. He had no idea what was crossing the lake toward him. Ethan Allen did not set out to be a revolutionary. He set out to be right. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because the men who start revolutions out of principle are one kind of person, and the men who start them because they cannot tolerate being told they are wrong are another kind entirely. Allen was firmly, constitutionally, the second kind. He was born in Litchfield, Connecticut in 1738, the eldest of 8 children, in a family that had land but not much else. His father Joseph died when Ethan was 17, which ended his plans for formal education and handed him responsibility for his mother and siblings at an age when most young men were still learning to manage themselves. He tried iron manufacturing in his 20s. It failed. He tried farming. It worked only in the way that hard farming in poor soil works, which is to say barely, and not forever. What Allen had, beyond size, he was reportedly enormous, well over 6 feet in an era when that was genuinely remarkable, was an absolute refusal to accept a smaller life than the one he believed he deserved. He moved north to the New Hampshire grants in the 1760s, a disputed stretch of land that would eventually become Vermont, and he started buying up parcels. The problem was that New York also claimed the same territory and had its own patents, its own courts, and its own sheriffs who arrived periodically to tell men like Allen that their deeds were worthless and their farms belonged to someone else. Allen responded by forming the Green Mountain Boys, officially a militia, practically a vigilante organization that specialized in making life uncomfortable for New York officials who wandered into Vermont. Allen and his men burned barns, threatened magistrates, and drove off surveyors with a consistency that the New York governor eventually responded to by putting a price on Allen's head: 75 pounds for his capture. Allen reportedly responded to the bounty by offering a counter-reward of similar size for the governor's arrest. He was not joking. He was never joking. Here is the thing about a man who spends a decade fighting a land dispute with a colonial government through organized intimidation and the occasional arson. By the time an actual revolution arrives, he already has a militia, already has a network of loyal men who follow him specifically, and already has a complete indifference to whether the authorities approve of what he is doing. The Continental Congress had not authorized anything in May of 1775. Allen did not notice. The plan had 3 problems. Allen solved all 3 by ignoring them. Problem 1. He had no authorization. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety had discussed taking Ticonderoga in the days after Lexington and Concord. The cannons inside were no secret, and the patriots in Cambridge who were besieging Boston desperately needed artillery. But discussing and authorizing are different things, and no colonial government had formally told anyone to go take a British fort. Allen did not wait for formal authorization. He had spent a decade operating without New York's permission. Operating without Philadelphia's was not a significant adjustment. Problem 2. He had no boats. Fort Ticonderoga sat on the western shore of Lake Champlain. Allen's Green Mountain Boys were assembling on the eastern shore. Between them was a lake cold enough in early May to kill a man who fell in, and Allen had no vessels capable of carrying an assault force across it. He sent men to find boats, any boats, wherever they could be located, with instructions that did not place excessive emphasis on whether the boats currently belonged to someone else. Problem 3. He had roughly 150 men. Then the boats failed to materialize in the numbers he needed, and by the night of May 9th, he had ferried only 83 of them across to the western shore before the operation had to proceed or lose the darkness entirely. On paper, 83 men against a fortified British position with 48 soldiers and stone walls was not a plan. It was a wish. On the ground, it was the only option available before daylight made the entire approach visible, before the element of surprise, the one advantage Allen actually held, burned off with the morning. Stop for a moment and ask why he did not simply wait. More boats, more men, better odds. The rational calculation said wait. Allen could not wait, because Allen had never in his life been able to tolerate the possibility that someone else might act first. He had built the Green Mountain Boys because he refused to let New York sheriffs tell him what he owned. He had kept them together for a decade because backing down was physically incompatible with who he was. He was not fearless. He was constitutionally unable to choose the smaller version of anything. He formed his 83 men into a column in the dark and walked toward the fort. The shore on the western side of Lake Champlain in the pre-dawn dark of May 10, 1775, was not a comfortable place to be. 83 men stood in wet boots on cold ground, having crossed a lake in boats that were not theirs, in darkness thick enough that the fort above them was more a shape than a structure. Stone walls, a gate, the outline of something enormous against a sky just beginning to consider the possibility of gray.
Allen formed them into a column 3 men wide. No artillery, no ladders, no siege equipment of any kind.
What he had was the dark, the cold, the element of surprise, and the specific quality he had always had in excess, the absolute inability to stop once he had started. They moved toward the main gate. A British sentry at the postern entrance spotted them, raised his musket, and pulled the trigger. The weapon misfired, a small mechanical failure in the dark that had no reason to go Allen's way, and did anyway. The sentry turned and ran into the fort. Allen's men poured through the open gate behind him before anyone on the other side had time to organize a response. They were inside. Allen pushed through the fort's interior toward the officers' quarters, shouting for the garrison to surrender. The men inside, woken from sleep, in the dark, with no clarity on how many men were coming through their gates or from what direction, did not fight.
They froze, which in the context of a night assault is functionally the same thing. Allen reached the door of the British commander's quarters and hammered on it with the handle of his sword. Captain William Delaplace opened it. He was not in uniform. He was in his nightclothes, standing in a doorway, looking at a very large man in frontier dress who was demanding the surrender of his fortress in a voice that left no room for negotiation. Allen reportedly said, the exact wording disputed across his own multiple later accounts, that he demanded the surrender of the fort in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress had not authorized this operation. You heard that right. Delaplace stood in his doorway. Subscribe now if you haven't, because what he does in the next 30 seconds is not what anyone expected, and it is the moment the whole war quietly changed direction.
Delaplace looked at Ethan Allen for a moment that the historical record does not time precisely. Then he surrendered. Not after negotiation, not after consulting his officers or assessing his tactical options, or sending word to his garrison to prepare a defense. He stood in his doorway in his nightclothes, looked at the large man with the sword demanding his fortress, and understood, in the specific, clarifying way that men understand things when the gap between their assumptions and their reality collapses in an instant, that the situation was already decided. He asked by what authority Allen demanded the surrender. Allen's reply, in his own later account, was that he demanded it in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Whether those were the exact words is disputed. Allen told the story several times in several slightly different versions, which is what happens when a man becomes famous and the story becomes larger than the event. What is not disputed is the general shape of it. Allen invoked two authorities, one divine and one political. The Continental Congress had not authorized this operation. The Great Jehovah, as far as the record shows, had not been consulted either. Delaplace handed over his sword. The British garrison, roughly 48 soldiers, woken from sleep, confronted with armed men already inside their walls, did not fight. There was no pitched battle inside the fort. no heroic last stand, no organized resistance of any kind. They came out of their quarters into the pre-dawn dark and found the situation settled. The whole thing, from the moment Allen's men came through the gate to the moment Delaplace surrendered, lasted roughly 10 minutes. 10 minutes. For the key to the continent. Allen's men spread through the fort in the gray of early morning, and what they found as the light came up stopped even men who had crossed a lake in stolen boats on nothing but nerve.
78 cannons and mortars, not hidden, not disabled, not spiked or removed or prepared for demolition, sitting, in various states of readiness, in a fort that had been garrisoned so lightly for so long that the equipment inside had simply accumulated. The military hardware of decades of strategic importance, left intact because nobody had thought to do otherwise, because nobody had believed this was possible. Allen walked among them in the morning light. He had come here for a fort. What he had found was an arsenal, the largest single concentration of artillery available to the American cause at that moment in the war, at a moment when Washington's forces besieging Boston had almost none. They had crossed in stolen boats with no orders, 83 men against a fortified garrison, and they had found the weapon that could win a city without firing a shot. The question was how to move them. 300 miles of mountains and frozen rivers stood between those cannons and Boston. Here is the detail that most accounts of this story skip over entirely. Ethan Allen did not walk through the gate of Fort Ticonderoga alone. Walking beside him, at essentially the same moment, was a 34-year-old Connecticut merchant and militia officer named Benedict Arnold, who held a formal commission from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety authorizing him to raise troops and take Ticonderoga, and who had arrived at the staging area on the eastern shore of Lake Champlain several days before the crossing to find Allen already there with his Green Mountain Boys, already organized, already committed. Arnold had paper authority. Allen had 83 men who would follow Allen and nobody else. Arnold demanded joint command of the operation. Allen's men refused to serve under anyone but Allen.
The historical record does not capture exactly what was said between the two men in those hours before the crossing, but the outcome is clear. Arnold crossed the lake, walked through the gate, and stood present at the surrender, and Allen wrote the memoir. In Allen's own published account of the Ticonderoga operation, the most famous document of his life, Arnold appears briefly, awkwardly, and then essentially disappears. The operation is Allen's. The authority is Allen's. The victory is Allen's. Arnold's name is there. His role is not. Pay attention to what this means, because it is not a small thing. Arnold held legitimate authorization from an actual colonial government body. Allen held the loyalty of the men on the ground. In 1775, on the western shore of Lake Champlain before dawn, only one of those things mattered.
What makes this genuinely strange and genuinely sad in hindsight is that Benedict Arnold, in May of 1775, was a capable, brave, and legitimately authorized officer who had done everything correctly. He had the commission. He had traveled to the staging area. He had been present at the capture. He just could not make 83 Green Mountain Boys take orders from someone other than the man they had followed for a decade. History remembered Allen. Arnold it remembered for something else entirely. The man Washington chose to move 78 cannons 300 miles through a New England winter was 25 years old and had never commanded a military operation in his life. Henry Knox had been running a bookshop in Boston before the war started.
That is not a metaphor or an understatement. He was literally a bookseller, a large, bookish young man who had educated himself in military history and engineering by reading the books he sold, and who had walked into Washington's camp after Lexington and Concord and proposed, with the specific confidence of someone who has read extensively about something and not yet attempted it, that he could retrieve the Ticonderoga cannons and bring them to Boston. Washington looked at his situation. No artillery, a besieged city he could not take without it, and no obvious alternative, and said yes. Knox left for Ticonderoga in November of 1775. What followed was a 56-day journey that should not have worked, and worked anyway. He built sleds, he hired oxen, he moved the cannons, all 78 of them, totaling roughly 60 tons of iron, across frozen Lake George, through the Berkshire Mountains, down through Massachusetts in the kind of winter that punishes optimism. Lake ice cracked under the weight and was coaxed back to solidity by dropping temperatures. Sleds broke and were repaired. Knox wrote to Washington with consistent, cheerful updates that conveyed, between the lines, the specific exhaustion of a man who had committed publicly to something enormous and could not afford to fail at it. He arrived in Cambridge in late January of 1776 with all of it intact. Washington moved the cannons onto the Dorchester Heights above Boston on the night of March 4th. A single night's work, conducted in silence, the guns hauled into position before dawn, while the British garrison below slept. The British commander, General William Howe, woke on the morning of March 5th and looked up. The heights above his position, which had been empty the night before, were now fortified with artillery capable of firing directly into his ships in the harbor and his troops in the city below. He reportedly said, the exact words vary across accounts, that the rebels had done more in one night than his entire army could have done in months. He called a council of war. The council concluded what Howe had already understood when he looked up at those guns. There was nothing to discuss. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston. 11,000 soldiers and roughly 1,000 Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed for Halifax. They never came back. The first major strategic victory of the American Revolution was won without a single engagement. It ran directly back through Knox's sleds, through Allen's boats, through a 10-minute operation on a cold May morning at the edge of a lake. The fort at Ticonderoga stands today essentially where Ethan Allen found it in 1775, restored over the past century by private preservation efforts into one of the best-maintained 18th-century military sites in North America. You can walk the same stone walls, you can stand at the King's Garden, look out across Lake Champlain toward the exact shoreline Allen's boats pushed off from in the dark, and watch the water do what it has always done, indifferent to what crossed it that night. Restored cannons sit on the ramparts now, positioned close to where the originals once stood before Henry Knox dragged them south into history. The view from those walls toward the lake's narrow point still explains, without a single placard needed, why the French called this position the key to an entire continent. Stand there in early morning mist, and the fort feels less like a museum than a place that is still quietly waiting for something. Ethan Allen did not get to enjoy his fame for long. In September of 1775, months after Ticonderoga, he was captured during a reckless and unauthorized attempt to take Montreal, a plan built on the same instincts that had worked at Ticonderoga, and this time collided with an enemy that was actually prepared. He spent nearly 3 years as a British prisoner, much of it in irons, shipped between Halifax, England and New York, treated at various points with a severity that nearly killed him. He was exchanged in 1778 and returned to a war that had moved on without him, to a Continental Army now under Washington's formal command, fighting battles Allen had no part in. He spent his remaining years back in Vermont, still fighting over land, still constitutionally incapable of a smaller life. And he died in 1789, having watched the country he helped ignite absorb his contribution into a larger story that rarely mentioned his name specifically. Congress, in the years after Ticonderoga, briefly debated whether the fort should be returned to Britain to avoid escalating a conflict that many delegates still hoped could be resolved short of full war. You heard that right. They considered giving it back. Then they quietly kept the cannons and never spoke of the debate again. Sometimes, the men who change the course of a war are the ones nobody authorized to start it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment. Do you think Congress was right to even consider returning the fort to Britain? The answers on that one are always more divided than you'd expect, and I read every single comment.